Hi everyone, welcome back to The Citizen. My name is Johannes and I'm here with Daisy Johnston. This week we interviewed Dr. Stephen Nuño-Perez about polling. Let's jump into this interview.
Hi, I'm Daisy Johnston, the assistant news editor at the Lumberjack, and today I am joined by our guest, Stephen Nuño-Perez, a professor here at the Department of Politics and International Affairs, worked with NBC News for 8 years, and a fellow Angelino. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Did you want to talk a bit about what your research is at LMU?
Okay, so most of my research centers around understanding the behavior of Latinos and hard-to-reach populations. And so prior to really roughly 1980s, right, like most of the research we've done has been on, the majority community, right? So not really looking at, how different communities, how they behave in certain situations, especially when it comes to politics, right? Like, why do African American communities vote, right? Or why do people in Latino communities vote or not vote, or what's that process like, right? And so much of the research we've done prior to 1980 was done on mostly white populations, right? And so when I went to grad school in 2000, 100 years ago, saw much of the data that we were using to do research did not include the community I was from. And so since then, I kind of mostly dedicated my academic career to gathering that kind of data.
And so must be a big time for someone in your line of work.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, right? A lot of times you are in situations, especially when you're doing research, you're not necessarily researching what's great and amazing. You're researching where we can improve, right? And the problems that are out there that are affecting your community. And so being a social scientist is never entirely awesome because you're studying things that aren't necessarily going to be awesome to do research on, right?
Right.
And so, especially since 2016, that election has been an indicator of a lot of different changes that the country's going through, and how it's impacting. Today, when we look at the issues and how these decisions that we're making are going to impact the access to health care for women, right? Or immigration policy or economic or policy. All those policies really have an impact on not only the country but disproportionately on people with less power.
And I'm just going to read off a few questions
Sure.
that are based on just questions the Lumberjack staff had for you.
Okay.
And we think will be helpful for this election project.
Okay, cool.
So how do the polls forecast the turnout for young voters in this election?
Good question. So younger people are a little bit harder to pin down on when it comes to predicting their behavior because, as you know, younger people are less predictable than older people. But I think in this election, there was a lot of concern about the appeal that Joe Biden had to younger voters. And when he dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris came in, there's been this kind of resurgence of energy amongst younger people because even though she's, I think, close to 60 years old, right? To young people, that's really old, but it's younger, right, than Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who's only 2 or 3 years younger than Biden. So I think younger people are seeing a little bit more of themselves in the Harris campaign, and also the Harris campaign probably has younger people working for her, right? She's a little bit from a little bit different generation. And I think, like the TikTok growth and the social media and has created a lot more energy in her campaign. So we'll see. Hopefully that is a predictor of greater participation amongst young people.
And you bringing up that young people are unpredictable is actually something I want to ask you because you don't hear a lot of young people talking about, oh, I just took a poll yesterday.
Yes.
How do young people respond to polls? Do they take them?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
So there are different techniques and methods that polling companies take to getting young people, anybody, to fill out a survey or a poll. first of all, making it easy to take, right? So you get a text message and a link, and it'll go to a form that you can fill out, and making it easy to do that. And you have to contact a lot of people to get a certain number of responses, right? So like the response rate is really low, but going to them where they're at, like whether it's in social media or through text messaging or any of those types of like digital campaigns, or they have a response rate, and you just have to contact a lot of people. I wish younger people would take the surveys and the polls seriously when they see it, is because you're actually communicating with someone that wants to know your opinion, right? And there's a lot of skepticism about surveys and polls, and there's to be honest, there's a lot of companies out there that don't take it seriously from a research standpoint, right, from a methodological standpoint. But there are companies that do it very well, right? And a lot of those companies you don't hear about because they're not necessarily publishing or promoting their findings, because that's not the purpose of it, right? So a lot of companies will do surveys because they want to influence people, right? And so those surveys are a little bit they're done a little bit differently than, say, a survey that actually is more concerned about how people actually feel about something, rather than trying to like project, like here's what our constituent believes, or here's what this group believes about our issue, right? And so like those people have different incentives than, say, a person who's running for office, and so like I don't really care what they think, I just want to know what they think, right? And so like that's a different perspective in how seriously you take the methodology in approaching people.
And how seriously do you think that these methodology services take young voters, or how seriously do campaigns take young voters if they're not always showing up for these polls?
Very seriously. I mean, especially on, both sides of the aisle, I think really care about getting young people's votes. But I think Democrats in particular are have a greater ecosystem that integrates young people's thinking into policy, right? So like, there's more groups out there that are concerned about mobilizing young people and understanding what their issues are out there. The problem with young people is young people get old, right? And so like, if you're 18, you're only 18 for 1 year, right? And you're in college for 4 years or 5 years. And so like, it's really hard for an institution or for organizations to maintain any energy in an organization that focuses on young people, because those young people, file out after a couple of years, and you have to like constantly try to recruit and keep and, educate, young people. And once they're mobilized and educated, they look for other opportunities, right? They're like, oh, I'm 21, I no longer live in this state, or I have a job in another state, and so I'm going to go somewhere else, right? So like, young people are going to be a little bit more mobile, they have fewer resources, right? And so like, they're just more difficult to maintain contact with, and to keep excited, and to constantly educate why you should participate, right? So like, that's hard, and unfortunately, our government and our society doesn't really take that seriously, right? Like, there's no investment in, there's no policy investment in young people, in the sense that, some states are better at it, right? It's like California, right? You can register, or you're automatically registered, or so that when you turn 18, you get your voter ID in the mail, right? That is automatic. Or, but in some states, you have to fight to participate, right? And I wish, that we had better policies that took our democracy more serious. And
the difficulties of mobilizing young voters is really interesting. Is there a way around this for campaigns?
Absolutely. I mean, well, for the campaign, or for like in general?
For polls, people who do polls.
Yeah, I mean, the solution is there are a lot of solutions out there, but like, some solutions are, automatic registration, right? Like, everybody here, if you're born in the United States, gets a Social Security number, right? Like, we figure that out. But we figure that out because there's an incentive to understand and get taxes, right? And to understand, and those people are going to get access to benefits like Social Security later and Medicare and things like that, right? So there is an incentive to track everybody from the time they're born to the time they're death, right? But we don't take that same approach when it comes to this is a citizen that we want to participate in our democracy, and if we took it seriously, this with the same same importance, everybody here would be registered, and the government would make sure that they knew that you had the opportunity to participate. So really, there are very easy solutions out there, right? The problem is that there are forces out there that don't want you to participate, right? And win elections when you don't participate. And like I tell students all the time, is everyone who works gets their first paycheck and notices that not only is there a tax called FICA, right? But there are taxes called Medicare, right? So everybody here in this room who's less than 30 years old or 25 years old is literally paying 2% of their paycheck, and their employer is paying 2% of that paycheck to provide health care for old people, right? People over 65 years old. But none of those. There's no system in which there's a similar tax so that you guys can go to college, right, and get an affordable education. So it's really just about priorities, right? And that's how the system works, because older people are more likely to vote, and that's why old people get health care while you guys, are kind of left on your own. And there are people, you guys, if you're lucky enough to have parents that have health care, if you do, I'm sure your parents have told you many times that, when you're 26, you're no longer under my plan, right? And when you guys were younger, it was very normal for kids to turn 18 and no longer be covered under their parents' medical insurance plans, right? But it wasn't until the Affordable Care Act that it gave young people, right, access to health care under their parents' medical insurance until 26. I have 3 daughters, right, and so we're always timing your IUD or your so that when you're 26 you get your ID and you're like good to your 32, right? Whereas if you don't time it right, you're 27 and you're struggling, and you find out that without health care that could cost thousands of dollars, right? So really it's just about the country's values and what the country prioritizes, and generally it's not going to be young people.
And the point that you brought up about student tuition and how there's not a 2% tax taken on paychecks to pay for that. I saw a poll the other day that said student debt is the least issue that college voters care about. Yeah. I was just wondering, is that true?
I don't know. First of all, it's hard to remember that the majority of the people in this country do not have a college education, right? So, like, to the majority of the people in this country, college debt isn't a problem because they don't go to college, right? So, and even in a place like Arizona, where you're talking about maybe 30%, right, of people that graduate from high school go to college. So it's not an important issue because it doesn't affect everybody, in the sense that people think that I'm not going to college, so I'm not going to have college debt, right? I think it would be a more important issue for young people if we had a conversation about whether or not we should have free college, right? I mean, other countries have figured this out, right, and see the value in that. And for young people who we open up those opportunities to go to college, right? Then it's your decision whether or not you want to go to college. Not I'm not going to college because I can afford it, right? And so, and then a lot of times when folks can't afford college, right, they start to reason with it, right? Like, oh, college is stupid. Why would I want to go to college, right? I can make a lot of money, doing this, this other labor task, right? And so they, when you're young, it's okay to use your body for labor, right? But like that when you're old like me, like constantly having to use your body to provide labor and gets a lot harder, right? And so college opens up a lot of different opportunities, regardless of what you think about it. When you're 18, 19, 20, and have different, your body's different, your energy's different, and you're more healthy, right? And so, it would be a lot different if I think we just gave everybody the opportunity to have an education. And I think if we framed it in that way, I think younger people would be a little bit more responsive to it.
And on that topic, what do you think are the 3 most important issues to young voters in this election season?
Well, I would say right now at the top, I mean, the economy is, far and away the most important issue, right? Everyone sort of thinks of the economy. It's kind of like this. There's this funny comic out there where there's the asteroid or the comet that is destroying the world, 65 million years ago, and there's dinosaurs looking at the asteroid, and one of the dinosaurs says, but what about the economy? Like what are we going to do if the economy is destroyed with this asteroid? We tend to frame, our health as a country based on the economy, right? Like there's this old saying, the CEO from GE was, General Electric, saying, what's good for General Electric is good for the country, right? And so we tend to conflate these two things, right? And society tends to do it. And it would be great, if we didn't have that, that value or that cultural value. But we do, and so everyone thinks like if the economy's good, I'm good, right? And so the economy and jobs. I think there's especially for women, abortion is really high up there and probably close. I wouldn't say it's close, but it was number 2 or number 3, right? Especially for women, is abortion. In a state like Arizona, we see younger women are more concerned about abortion, access to abortion, for obvious reasons. But there's also young men are less concerned about that, So, and then, you get things like access to education and things that young people, are facing their problems, right? And it's kind of ironic, right? Because you have one side of the aisle that keeps talking about family values and we want to encourage and families and stuff. And I think at this age, a lot of young people are thinking about what's the next 10 years of my life going to look like, right? And that could be more education, it could be work, it could be family. And I think if making those decisions easier for people to make, would vastly help younger folks. But I think that's also what's on the mind of young folks as well.
And do you think that's going to be enough to mobilize people in November?
It's interesting because there, especially now, right? There are fewer boomers out there today than there were 4 years ago, right? And 4 years ago, there were fewer boomers alive than there was in 2016, right? So 2016 to now, 8 years later, we've seen a transformation of what the electorate looks like, right? So like you have fewer boomers, right? And these are people with a particular, set of values and cultural experiences that influenced how they viewed, what Donald Trump was saying, and also how they viewed Hillary Clinton, right? And that was rough terrain for Hillary Clinton, right? To run for office. Not only that, but Hillary Clinton had a long history in politics, and so there was a lot there that was, I think, very damaging to her candidacy. But also, I think there was just a very cultural resistance to her by old people, right? And just don't see women as leaders and don't see women as being strong, and there's no way she could win, right? If she was detailed about her policies, it was like, oh, this is boring, right? This is not, people don't want to hear these details, right? And then if she doesn't have details, it's like she doesn't know what she's talking about, right? We need more details, right? And so like you're in this kind of position, as a woman candidate, where it's nearly impossible to satisfy people. And then you got a lot of men who are like, well, if she had answered it this way, I would have voted for her, but she didn't, right? And so like, so it's very difficult, right? But that election, that electorate, that population is different now, right? So like, I think younger people are more comfortable with women in positions of leadership. Younger people are more comfortable with people of color in positions of leadership, right? And that is going to, I think, change, who we elect, right? And Donald Trump very much looks like the past right now, right? He looks like an era in American history that was probably an era long past, 20 years ago, right? But a lot of people were really trying to hold on to, and still today, trying to hold on to an image of the United States that no longer exists, right? And so I think young people have also, especially people in your generation, right? When you guys were born, into like a recession, right? In which, in 2008, there was this huge recession. And so you guys probably don't remember that, right? But your parents do. And you probably remember, parents talking about it all the time and blaming people for it. And then we have this COVID, COVID issue emerge, and you guys are in high school or in grammar school, doing school from online, and people are dying everywhere, and you're just kind of like, what's going on? Is this life? Is this what it's supposed to be? And then you hear a lot of messaging on climate change, and the world's going to burn up, and the sea levels are going to rise, and and we're going to have drought and famine, and so like I can imagine being 18, 19, 20 years old, and listening to this and wondering like who's going to help solve these problems, and sort of looking for answers, or just kind of like, this is just not the world for me, and so it's very difficult to get young folks who are kind of just emerging out of their, into their adulthood, trying to like process all these things that have happened to them over the last 10 years, right? And then saying, what do I do about this, right? I'm just a kid, right? I'm just 18 years old, or the system's set up against me. And so it's easy to get frustrated. It's easy to just say, like there's nothing I can do about it, right? And not have a collective conscience as young people, and saying like, oh, we as a group, right, can be very powerful. But by the time you realize that, you're already old. You're old, right? You're out of college, right? You're like, and so unless you grow up into that, right? You grow up and your parents are teaching you this, right? So like higher educated students who come from families that have parents who are higher educated, right? Your parents, if you have higher education, your dad's a professor, your mom's a doctor, right? Is telling you this just through osmosis and how they live, right? So as a kid, you see your parents checking their registration every 2 years, right? Because they're going to vote, right? And you just so younger kids who come from those kinds of environments are kind of used to it, and kind of wonder why isn't everybody else care that there's an election, But because we have a system that isn't necessarily integrating, poor people or people with fewer resources, right? And the kids who come up in those environments just don't see the connection, right? So it just takes a lot of work, and the amount of work that it takes is, by the time that work is done or making an impact, right, that kid is already out of college, right? Or has other issues, right? They're trying to pay the bills, or trying to find a job, or so, and they're sort of out of reach of that system, right? Because they care about working and getting the hours in, finding the work and working on their career path, right? Than caring about politics.
So I actually want to touch back on something you said, because when we talk about the issues that young voters tend to care about, it is normally inflation or reproductive rights. But COVID should be such a big one for us, or maybe not. I mean, I'm not sure, but it was such a different landscape when we were all first voting, or couldn't vote, but entering college, in 2016, in 2020. And now it's a completely different landscape. Is that going to play to the Democrats' advantage or the Republicans?
Definitely not, because there's this collective amnesia about COVID, right? People forget that COVID was devastating to our country, right? A million people died, right? Like, when's the last time we had an event in the United States where a million people died from it, right? And we had leadership that did not make decisions that made that better, right? And in fact, we know, right, that the United States responded to COVID, very poorly, and that poor response caused people to die. And not only was it a poor response, but it was people encouraging other people to make really bad decisions, like don't wear a mask, right? And or you don't have to stay home. You should, if you want to live your life, you should be able to live your life and go to a restaurant, right? And that type of leadership encouraged people to do that kind of behavior, and that costs us lives, but 4 years later, a lot of people just sort of forget that was a thing, right? And don't really hold anybody responsible for that, right? I mean, we just saw, one of the candidates, at Arlington, Cemetery, talking about 13 people that died, right? Like, but here we are talking, a million people dying, from this, and we just sort of don't care, right? In the sense that it's not given the same attention that, it can't be politicized in the same way as, people in gravestones and, a politician kind of using that against their opponent. But how do you use this kind of amorphous event that had great individual impact on people, right? But as an event, it was just sort of, people have just sort of forgotten it. Maybe it's collective trauma, maybe it's we need to move forward. It was a traumatic time for our country, and I think a lot of people just sort of want to forget that happened.
And is it an issue that young voters should care about?
I think you should care about it because it was an indicator of how this country responds to your health, right? And these kinds of events really bring out the value system of who we are, right? Is when something happens and you're forced to make decisions, you make decisions based on what your values are. And these kinds of events that are not ordinary, right? So like when there's a crisis, they force you to lean on what you value, right? And what we valued was forcing poor people to work, right? We call them essential workers, right? And we started celebrating them as if they were heroes. But like, do we really care about them? We just care about them, delivering food. We care about them keeping it going so that I can stay at home and I could, safely work remotely and have someone deliver my food to me, right? Like, that's what we cared about, right? Is who's going to process the meat and the food, and who's going to deliver this stuff so that I can get it and be safe, and literally forcing people to work, right? That's sort of what we valued, right? Is we valued cheap labor as a country, right? Is having access to a population of people that are forced to work for us, right? And COVID really sort of brought that out for us. It made a lot of people comfortable, right? If you had access to resources, if you had a job that you could work remotely, you could, it was annoying, right? But like, it's kind of fascinating that those same people who are just sort of, relatively speaking, just had to be annoyed, right? Or the ones speaking loudest about their rights, right? And taking over, state capitals because they were being asked to wear a mask, right? So like, we can see like this disparity in how people see how entitled they are, right? So like, if you're a worker, or if you're young, or if you're don't have any resources, right? Like, you have to put up with a lot of violations of your humanity. But you get to stay at home, and you have access to thousands of dollars of military equipment that you can use because you want to play soldier. You feel like this is a huge violation your rights, right? Which just shows just how comfortable you must be to think like this is a violation. It was like just being asked to wear a mask, right? And those people just saw that as like it might as well have been like a genocide, as like being asked to wear a mask. So yeah, I think if you're young and you look at that, like kind of like when you're dating, right, and you see somebody and you go through a situation with them, and all of a sudden that person is not behaving in ways that make you feel like you're important to them, right? That's a pretty good indicator that this is not a person that you want to stay with, right? Because what happens the next time something bad happens, right? This person is not going to think I'm important. They're going to focus on themselves, right? They're not going to focus on us as a couple or me as a person if I'm suffering, right? This person's going to be centered around, what about me, right? So like when those things happen and you're with a person, right, and you're like, oh, this person didn't really behave the way I thought he was going to behave. When everything's good, it's easy to be like, oh, everything's great, right? And I'm going to do things for you, and I'm going to help you, and I want to be with you, and blah, blah, blah. And then things go wrong, right? And then all of a sudden, all that goes away, right? And so, like, that's a really kind of, revealing who you are. And COVID sort of revealed who we were as a country, right? And so I think young people should really care about that.
And I want to center it back to the polls,
Yeah.
just in this question. If there's anything, we've talked about the unpredictability of voters and people acting in ways that maybe are not typical of their demographic. Is there anything that you think the polls this election season have been missing?
What have the polls been missing? That's a little bit hard for me to answer because I don't think we miss a lot, right? What we miss is how the media takes the polls and interprets them. I think there's a lot in the polls and in how we do them to understand a lot about, different groups, right? And different, how we break them down, right? And so like, we know a lot about how people behave. It's really about how do we convince people to care about these people, right? Whether it's young women, right, or whether it's minorities in communities that don't necessarily have the resources, right? And so like I think the hard part is convincing the system to care about people that they may not see the same value in because or frankly it's just more expensive, right? If I want to get these people to vote, it's going to cost me more to do it, and I don't have enough money to do that. So I'm just going to focus on people where I know I have access to. I know where I have access to in terms of how our systems of government works, right? You have a lot of people right now who are like on TikTok or, it's like, can you please stop calling me? And can you please stop emailing me? Can you please stop? There are people out there that don't get contacted, right? Because they're not registered to vote, right? They're not doing things that indicate that they care about the system. But a lot of it is that the system goes to you when you're wealthy or you're middle class or you're you're white, right? And you grow up in a neighborhood where that's just part of how things work, right? And so you will get, a card on your door or you get, knocks on your door. And so the real work is going to the places where that doesn't happen as much. And so that just requires, it just requires a change in how we value, right, people and how we value different people. So I think the polls, if anything, what people don't look at when they see the polls, they just see the number, right? Like, oh, Kamala Harris is, at 48% or 50%, whatever the number is, right? It's not necessarily the number is important, but a lot of times it's like the underlying numbers, right? Like, where is her support coming from, right? Where, if she increased her vote from, or her support, when she first announced from 47% to now 50%, which is just making up numbers. But it's like a lot of people just sort of focus on, 3%, right? What a lot of people don't focus on is like, where is that 3% coming from? And I think Kamala Harris has really raised the awareness of young women, right, and people of color, Also, she spent a lot of her time, especially in the last month, last couple of weeks, right, in places like Atlanta and Philadelphia and Milwaukee and Las Vegas and Phoenix, which in the past, a lot of presidents have spent their time in more rural and more suburban areas, and so maybe we'll start seeing greater attention, to those types of centers, right? Half of the population in Arizona is in Phoenix. But if you don't value the narrative that Phoenix matters as an urban environment, right, which we have a lot to say about as a society, right? Like, urban environments are where bad things happen, right? Urban environments is where there's crime. Urban environments is where there's homelessness, right? And when we talk about homelessness, we generally talk about homeless people like they're a rat problem, an infestation, right? We don't talk about homeless people like we need to do a better job of providing housing, right? Like these people are here because we don't provide housing adequately. A lot of times the narrative is like, what are you going to do about the homeless problem? It's like, well, I'm going to round them up basically and put them somewhere where you can't see them, right? So like that's how we view cities. In this country, right? We think, and like you look at commercials, right? Like Chevrolet, right? It's like you're in the homeland, right? And you're in this this remote place that's this in the middle of nowhere, and it's beautiful, and it's very this kind of like Americana sort of image, right? And that's really been changing in the last 20 years, where more of our presidential candidates identify with more urban type of areas, right? Barack Obama was seen mostly as an urban president. And you see the imagery a lot of our presidents have, right? It's like in their pickup truck in the middle of the country, right? And that is changing, right? And I think the Harris campaign is taking that a lot more serious than we have in the past. And so I think that has a lot of potential for change.
And so just to talk about the polls again, because obviously it is a science, so the margin of error is small. But in 2020, Trump was certain he had won this state. I'm just wondering, have you seen like different methods used, and what goes wrong in a situation like that, and how does that get improved on? Because obviously the science is always improving.
Yeah, I mean, the science is improving in the sense that we always have to adjust how people are behaving, right? Like none of you have a phone on the wall, right? Not only any of you grown up with a phone on the wall, right? Like you might even have a plug on your wall at home, and you say, "Hey, Mom, what's this plug? What's this plug here?" It's like, "Oh, that's the phone, right?" Researchers have to adjust to how you live, right? So if we're going to get your opinion, we have to go to you rather than expecting you to come to us. So that's constantly changing, constantly changing, techniques to incentivize people to participate, changing techniques to recruit people to give their opinions. Your opinions are very important to us, right? And so it's also very important to us that the opinions we get are representative of who we're trying to understand, right? So those are things that researchers are very obsessed with, constantly trying to figure out how do we accurately understand what people think. And that's why, you said margin of error, and every poll has a margin of error because that's what inference is, right? Is we're inferring what people think based on data that we're collecting, and the better our data that we collect and the ways we collect it, the better our inferences are. But we know that there's going to be error in this, right? Just mathematically, right? We're not. It would be great if we could send out a poll and get 360 million people respond, right? But then we would have a pretty low margin of error because we would know what everybody thinks, at least at that moment. But we have to infer what people think based on a representation of people's opinions, right? And we know there's going to be error in that. So, which brings me to what you're saying. What do people miss about polls, or what are the polls missing? I think a lot of people think of polls as Kamala Harris is at 48%, and Trump is at 47%. Kamala Harris is in the lead. It's like no, she's not, right? Because there is a margin of error in those polls, right? So if it says it's 48% for Kamala Harris and there's a margin of error of 4 points, it could be 52% or it could be 44%. And similarly, Trump's, if he's at 47, he could be at 51 or he can be at 43, right? So like that's what margin of error means in a survey, right? So like when it's close, there's and someone can say like, oh well, she's higher than him. Statistically, it means nothing to us, right? If you're 48 and she's 47, it doesn't matter to us, right? It's statistically the same, right? What we do pay attention to is trends, right? Is like, oh, last week it was 47, and this week it's 48. There's maybe, right? Like that's a good sign, maybe. And if we continue to collect data and it continues to grow, then okay, you have more data. You have a trend, where you can say like, okay, there's actually a thing happening right now. But a lot, like Hillary Clinton, when people are like, oh, the polls are wrong during Hillary Clinton, it's like, actually, they were pretty accurate, like it's just, everything was within the margin of error, right? But people see one number is higher than another and they think that number should be, that's a true number, right? Oh, well, Hillary was, 49 and Trump was 48, or, she should have won. It's like, no, that's a pretty accurate prediction. You just are you're just over relying on what that means.
Right. And that's a good point you bring up, that we see the polls and we're not necessarily sure what the numbers mean. And like you said, what gets wrong about the polls is sometimes what the media does with it. And I see on the news that Kamala Harris is up by 1 point, then I think Kamala Harris is winning. Mm-hmm. So for people who aren't, experts in this area, how can we interpret polls without misconstruing what's being presented?
I think healthy skepticism in general is fine, and important. I think it's very ignorant and counterproductive to just be like, oh, it's just a poll, right? Well, polls are never right? That's just dumb, right? But it's very accurate to be like, okay, I see Kamala Harris is up by 1, right? What does that mean, right? And like to ask questions about that, not being, not looking at those numbers if there's kind of like set in stone or like 48 is better than 47. Obviously, if you're a candidate and you see multiple polls, like if you go to like 538.com where they collect this, all this data that's coming in, if you continue to see multiple polls showing, a movement in some direction, right? That's certainly a reason to be optimistic if your person is on that side. I would much rather be that person than the other person, right? Where you're looking at polls and they're continuing to come in and you're losing ground, right? Because it's not just one poll, right? It's like if you look on that webpage, like there's multiple polls coming in every day, right? And so if you see multiple polls that are using somewhat tiny different techniques in getting that data and they're continuing to come back, relatively the same, like that's a good sign for you, right? Or for your person, or that's your campaign. That doesn't mean, that's what's happening or that's what's going to happen, right? So like, we've obviously seen movement in the polls in the last 2 weeks, right? Obviously, we've seen that a lot. For a researcher, that says that there's maybe something going on out there, right? But like, we're not going to answer everything for you, right? So like, there's other people out there who are observing. There's other mechanisms to get to understand whether or not this is a thing, right? And some of those mechanisms are, people who are making phone calls, right? People who are donating, people who are volunteering, right? So like these mechanisms we see higher activity in, right? And so like when you have the collection of data, right? Like, oh, we had, they said something like 500,000 people are volunteering in Georgia. Like, okay, that actually says something that my poll certainly validates, right? Like my poll sees higher excitement amongst young people. And then you see data coming in from the campaign saying, yeah, we got, 100,000 calls, just last week, right? Or, Taylor Swift just endorsed, and we got, 50,000 people registered to vote, right? So like, it's not just polls are not the only answer, right? They're part of how we understand what's going on out there, right? And so like people on the ground who are feeding information to the campaigns or to the pollsters, all that is collected and viewed within that context, right? So when a pollster says, yeah, we see activity out there, it's like the polls are saying one thing, but also there's other data coming in that validates that, right? That supports that your poll is catching something, right? So I would also encourage people to not just look at polls, right? But also, like understand that your perspective is one perspective. So polls help us to focus in on what should I be looking at, right? Because you might be like, well, I don't know, none of my friends are excited about Kamala Harris, right? And if the poll says there's greater excitement for Kamala Harris, that should make you say, oh, is there? Like maybe let me look at that. Let me see like where I find this. Is there something there that I'm not catching as an individual, right? Because that's another thing that researchers do a lot is we don't trust ourselves. Like we don't. That's what the methodology is for. That's what the science is for. Because the science is supposed to overcome our biases and our humanity. As like I really want this to be a thing, but the science is not telling me it's a thing, right? So like that's where the training comes in which you're trying to rely on your methods, right? And just like when I said earlier, like when something bad happens, people react to it in a very emotional way sometimes. Research, the methods and the science is there to control that, right? To mitigate the human aspect of like, oh, let me ask these, I really want Harris to win, right? And so like, I'm just going to like revalidate myself, right? Which is what a lot of people do. And the science is there to help us to fight against that urge, that human urge to validate ourselves.
Right, and this feels like a massive problem is that people are using polls, which are science, to validate themselves. So how can people? I know it's kind of crazy to imagine someone like me just like crunching all the numbers daily.
Yeah.
But like, where can we go to get polls directly without the bias getting in the way?
Well, I would go to 538. It's a website that collects polls as they come in. People report to them, or they have ways of connecting to them that. Or they may scrape from their websites or whatever. And there's, that's 538. Nate Silver is a guy who does this, has been doing this a lot, and I don't think he no longer works for them. But if you go to that website, that has a regular, flow of poll results coming in from different places. And then, when you look at those polls, there's usually a link to those polls to the website where it's coming from, right? And what a lot of people don't do is like they don't click on those links and see who the pollster is, what their sample is, right? So a lot of times they might have low samples, like 400 or 500 people, or they might not look into how representative that sample is, right? So a lot of polls are really meant to understand a specific segment of the population, right? But a lot of times the media or people in general will take that and inflate what that means, right? So a lot of pollsters are always very careful, very careful to say who I'm talking about, right? Who my universe is in this survey, in this poll. But oftentimes one of the things that we find is trying to control how you can stretch what this poll means, right? And so that's been a struggle, right? And not to say, and to very much say that, there are a lot of pollsters out there that are not good. There's also that, right? Because people see a number and they think like, oh, well, their number, that cost me, $20,000 to get. And the numbers that they want look like the same numbers to me, but they're $50,000 to get. So like, I'm just going to pay the 20 And those numbers actually tell me that I'm right, right? So like there's a lot of incentive built into this system, right, for people to not only pay for polls that aren't done as well, but also to pay for polls that are just going to tell them what they want, right? Because if someone that you trust, right, and someone who's trying to influence you says, "Hey Daisy, this poll says this," and you're like, "Oh, well, that's awesome! Like, I'm validated, you're validated, everything's awesome," right? That to us is not what we're trying to do, right? But there are plenty of people out there who want to use those numbers to influence what people think, right? And so really it just requires being an active participant, right? And saying like, who do I trust? Why? And how do these things work? And how do I add that to the other sources of information that I can use to know what's going on out in the world?
And I was wondering if, for the audience at home, so they can know it's not as scary and it's not as, time consuming as it seems, if you could give them just like 3 questions that would be on a poll.
3 questions that would be on a poll?
Yeah.
I think that the first general question that you'll always see on a poll is, do you think we're going in the right direction or in the wrong direction as a country? Right, which is usually early on in the survey, right, is where people are trying to just understand where this person's coming from, right, and trying to get a sense of how optimistic or how negative you think the world is, right, like, and so like that's usually one of the first questions that you see on a poll, right, other than what we might call screener questions, right, is like, are you, what's your age, what's your gender, what, things that pollsters will use, and a lot of times you'll answer the question and you'll say, okay, thanks for taking our survey, right? It's because you didn't pass their screen, right? It's like they don't want you to, because they may already have enough people in your demographic, right? So you'll see that, and then you'll usually see like a question about here are 20 issues. Can you pick top 3 issues for you, right? So like that's another thing that we see a lot, is what are your most important issues. And then you'll see like approval, questions, right? How much do you approve of this person? And they'll go through a lot of different people that you may or may not know, right? So those are very common, surveys. And the other thing is like surveys, their value also increases when you have not only you have more data, but when you have more what we call longitudinal data, right? Where we have data over time, right? So like understanding how people saw how popular Biden was last year is important to us when we're also collecting data on how people think about Biden today, right? So like when you're doing a poll, it's a snapshot in time. And a lot of people say, well, when you're doing a poll, it's just a snapshot in time. Yeah, it is, but like there are a lot of snapshots every day, right? And so like there's also data that we go back to and we can say like, oh, here's where Biden was last year and here's this year, right? And of course, the professionals and the people with a lot of access to resources are doing this a lot, right? And not only are they doing it a lot, but they have access to organizations and networks that are doing it literally every day, right? So like knowing where Biden is today or where Harris is today or where Trump is today is good and important, but it's also good and important to know where they were last week or last year. After Roe v. Wade was overturned, right? It was for a lot of our polls, it was a top 3 issue, right? And then earlier in the year, it really fell to like bottom 10, right? Wow. In the lower half of the 10, right? And so what that tells you, right, is like the people who are running these polls, right, the organizations who are running these, that's good information for them to know, right? Because you're like, hey, it was number 3 last year, right after Roe v. Wade, was overturned. It was at number 3 for young women, and now it's like 8 or 9, right? Like it's consistently now it's lower. So what that says is we have to direct our resources, right, to making this group aware that this is a thing, right? And so then that's where those resources go, right? And so now there's resources going to making people aware that abortion is on the ballot, right? And there's now Prop 139, right? And so like all these things help to bring awareness to young folks, right? 139 is on the ballot for a reason, right? And that's because not only do we want to protect, women's access to abortion, but it's also going to help bring young people out into the, to vote. And if you're voting for 139, who are you going to vote for president, right? And so a lot of folks use these mechanisms, right, to bring awareness, right? And as a young person, you're not really making those connections, right? Like 139's on the ballot, blah, 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 right? But like there is a concerted effort, right, to bring awareness to young people, right? And Prop 139 is one of those efforts, right? And so like the reason why a lot more young people are going to vote in this election is because Prop 139 is on the ballot, right? It's unfortunate that we need that to get young people to vote, right? But those are the mechanisms we have. Those are the tools we have, right? And so those are the ones that we're using. And it's not like the other side doesn't do that as well, right? So like in the early 2000s, anti-gay marriage amendments were placed on the ballot to get conservatives to come out to vote, because that's what mobilized them, right? So like if you were conservative but you didn't like the candidates, which a lot of people don't, nobody likes Biden or Trump, right? Young people are like, these people I can't connect with. So how do we connect with these young people, right? And so for a lot of young people who would vote for, say, Bush, right, or Trump or Romney, right, or people who are not motivated by them but are motivated by, like, anti-gay, anti-gay marriage, issues. And so getting young people who say like, oh, I'm against gay marriage, I'm going to go vote, right, because this is important to me. And so a lot of these issues are used as levers, for young people, right? So 139 is a lever to help young people. I mean, they care about access to abortion, right? But if you think of the people who are fighting for access to abortion, if they're older, right? If you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, access to abortion really is not your problem, right? As a 60-year-old, man or woman, right? Where you're sort of like, well, I'm fine, I don't need access to abortion. But they want young people to have access to abortion, right? And they know that, if I make young people aware of this, right, they're going to vote for my guy, right, or my woman now, right? And so these are mechanisms that the system give us to get you to pay attention, right? And so Prop 139 is one of those mechanisms that's being used to help bring awareness to young people, right? Not to be entirely skeptical and is that a lot of these things are happening and you're aware of it because people are doing things to make you aware of it, right? And for a lot of young people, it's like, well, I just care, right? I just care, right? And it's like, well, yeah, you care within a system that is talking to you, right? And so like you are being talked to, right? You are being sought, and so. I know there's a lot of conversation like, oh, nobody cares about young people, right? But like, there's a lot of institutions and mechanisms out there that are being used to get you to be aware and to get you to care and to get you to participate.
Right. So, and now there's that side, and then on the more positive side, maybe it sounds like what you're saying is that if young people are showing up to these polls, they might just see an issue they care about on the ballot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hopefully. I mean, I think, and the other thing, is there's going to be more you voting now than there are boomers out there, right? So like your generation has the opportunity to set the stage for what direction this country goes in, right? Where do we go? Where are we going? What are the opportunities that we want to have in the future, right? And so every election is important, right? But I think this election in particular, there's a greater contrast between what one side wants and what the other side wants, really. And when you look at where one side wants to go, you get this image of like 1940s, 1950s America. And then with the other group, you get an image of really a way more diverse, way more culturally flexible, environment, right? And so like the question that I think young people have to kind of look at is like, what direction do I want to go, right? It's not necessarily like what's the very specific policy, like what does Kamala Harris have to say about this very specific policy. I think that's important, but I think what's also important is to look at like the narrative. Like where is this person going to take us? What direction is this person going to take us? Or this, and the other thing to remember is like this person is not just a person, right? They're the leader, but they're the ones that are going to be, hiring the people that are going to make a lot of the decisions, right? So like, do you want Donald Trump to hire the judges and the administrators and the staff and the, all those folks, or do you want Kamala Harris to, hire the judges and the staff and the administrators and the people in leadership positions that are going to make decisions? Because Kamala Harris can't decide on every little decision, right? So she has to appoint people. She has to make decisions about who she trusts, and so you really have to make a decision as to like, what direction do we want to go? Because that's the direction we're going to go, is because that's who they're going to hire. They're going to hire people who think like them, right? Who support what they think. And yesterday, it was, Harris was in an interview, and the interviewer said, if you're the president, are you going to appoint Republicans to your staff, right? To your cabinet? And she's like, yeah, of course I am. Like, I need different views. If I'm going to make a decision, I need multiple views about this issue, not just my view. And I thought that was a very smart way of approaching that, right? And a lot of I think smart people in general want disagreement in a conversation, right? People who I think are not smart, right, want people who agree with them, right? And that's the leadership styles that we're looking at right now, is someone who wants conversation, discussion, disagreement, different views, different experiences in this collective decision, right? And you have another person is like, I just want people who think like me and who are loyal to me. And you need to make a decision as an individual as to like, which one's going to be better, right, at addressing the next COVID, or addressing the next, recession. Because we're going to have them. They're going to happen, right? And that's no doubt we're going to have another crisis in the next 4 years. So it just depends on what leadership style do you want, and what values do you want to be in the office making those kinds of decisions.
Well, I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up.
Cool.
Great moral of the story here is show up and do your polls.
Yep.
Young people.
Participate.
And Stephen Nuño-Perez, thank you so much for showing up today.
Welcome back, everyone, from the interview. I'm sitting here with Daisy, and we're gonna debrief a little bit because political topics can sometimes be a little complicated. So we're gonna make sure you understand what you just listened to. So Daisy, kind of just tell me, what was your main takeaway from that interview?
I would say, sorry guys, early morning here at the Citizen. I would say one of my main takeaways is that polls are more important than you might think. And they get a lot of criticism, and I think that in the discussion, a really good point that was raised is that people can manipulate the polls. So one day a candidate may be up, and people can share that. A news outlet who's leaning a certain way can share that. And it's not necessarily accurate. That day could be a fluke, but it is important to look at the trends. So they're not nothing. They're still really important.
So if polls can be like that easily manipulated, why should people trust them if they see some statistic up?
Well, it's not that the polls themselves are being manipulated. Like we talk about with Dr. Stephen Nuño-Perez, is that the polls are a science, and there is a lot of theory and trial and error that goes into making them. They're not they're not constantly making mistakes. That's just not what the polls are. They're actually a very fine-tuned process. But you need to be wary of how they're being shared, more so is a better way to say it. And notice the trends. Like I said, and if you're using a reliable website, I think at the end there we talk about 538. And that website is generally thought of as a non-biased website that just shares polls.
And what was your impression of polls before going into this interview, and do you feel like that has changed since talking to him?
Well, polls get a lot of criticism in the news. Famously, Hillary Clinton was projected everywhere to lose. And, I'm not a polling expert. Like I said, again, it's a science, and that science sometimes can go over my head, and I tend to be more politically tuned in, and still I get confused by the polls, and, so there's stuff like that. Or in, the last election, Trump was, so sure that he was supposed to win Arizona because the polls predicted it, but he didn't. And, I think Stephen Nuño-Perez brought up a really good point, which is that the polls are not necessarily wrong. Like, he said that the polls were still accurate. So, that it definitely is worth looking into, I think. How the polls, it's this big story when we think we know something and it's not true. But maybe that shouldn't be blamed on the polls, but just how we've been letting ourselves interpret them.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about the work that he does.
Yeah.
So why is the work that he does important?
Well, he researches these polls. He helps fine-tune the process. And with each election cycle, it's no secret that technology is always progressing everything forward. And so with each election cycle, there are these mistakes sometimes, and they can constantly make it better. Or, he talked a lot about how they're reaching out to college students now because, Karow, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Have you ever done a poll before?
I have not.
And you know what? That's a lot of people our age. So
Yeah.
they are fine-tuning that process. They're making it, a text message that you can get. Who knows? Maybe it's going to be sliding into your Instagram DMs. It's going to be a Snapchat team member's story, whatever they call it now.
Yeah.
But, he is a part of that group that is making that process better.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. A lot of people in our generation don't accept random phone calls anymore because of scams and things like that. So having a new way to have young people start doing polls, I think is super important, and it's really cool that we got a chance to speak with him and kind of get into his mind on that whole process.
It's just so important. And the polls are the one thing that you can really look at and say, no one's lying to me here. But, and that is the importance of 538 and people like, the doctor who we brought on, that it's just, it's accurate. And then it gets changed in the post-production process somewhere along the lines. But yeah, it's just so important, the work that he does.
Awesome. All right. Well, that was our interview on polling. Stay tuned for next week where we're talking about debates. We'll see you next time.